Let's talk Romeo plus Juliet. So I think what's interesting about Romeo plus Juliet is the fact that it starts with the title, and we know from the title and the wording of the title that this is going to be a different sort of Romeo and Juliet, in the fact that it's not Romeo and Juliet, it is Romeo plus Juliet. So there's something very Baroque going on just in the use of the play of the title, and I think that is important to appreciate sort of when going into the movie, that what we're going to get is, yes, the story of Romeo and Juliet, but it's going to be a little bit different, and it's sort of going to be playing around with things and thinking about it in a sort of a Baroque kind of way. So this, of course, is a Baz Luhrmann film, and Baz Luhrmann is very much known for his unique sort of style and flashiness, I suppose you could call it. I think when we're looking at all of these adaptations across the course, it is important to think of, okay, who's actually adapting the work and what's their style and what's their identity as an adapter. And each director that we're looking at is sort of interested in the whole idea of adaptation, but they approach adaptation very differently. And that's something I'm really trying to get across with this course. It's not about that this is how you adapt or this is what adaptation is. It's actually looking at each individual and thinking how they adapt and how they bring their own unique way of adapting to the text. And Baz Luhrmann is very interesting because although he doesn't always adapt established sources, sometimes he comes up with a story himself, like with Strictly Ballroom. When he does adapt, he's actually very faithful and very tied to the source that he's adapting. He's very faithful to Romeo and Juliet as far as Shakespeare's dialogue and prose goes, and The Great Gatsby, which is sort of his other adaptation. Again, he's extremely faithful to the words that were written on the page, and it's kind of interesting because Baz goes so far with his visual razzmatazz and his visual style, but when it actually comes to the dialogue, he's very, very faithful, and he doesn't like to change much from the actual source, which I think is really fascinating. And there's a direct contrast here between what's actually being spoken and what's actually being shown. Now, Romeo and Juliet is clearly a canonical adaptation. This is an adaptation where we're so familiar with the work, it's almost as if we don't have to read the original. But what I put to you is this, and I haven't asked you to read Romeo and Juliet play this week for a number of reasons that we can talk about. But what happens to your experience when you haven't read the original? When you go into something, this is an adaptation, it's sold as an adaptation, you're watching it as an adaptation, you're watching it in an adaptation course, but you probably haven't read the original for a while. What actually happens to that experience? What happens is you're basing your viewing experience and the adaptation on your memory and how you actually remember Shakespeare. And for a lot of people, the experience of Romeo and Juliet isn't all that positive because you probably had to study it at high school. You were forced to do it. It became somewhat of a civic duty for you. You may have been played a film, or you had to go and see a play which was actually quite drab and dull and boring. So what Romeo and Juliet does is it breathes a new sense of life into that experience and that memory that you might have. And I think that is really interesting, what it's actually doing with our own memory of Romeo and Juliet and our own memory of really how Shakespeare has been traditionally played out. Something I would say is, Romeo and Juliet is a play. Now, a play is meant to be read, or they're meant to be performed. And there's been a lot of play scholars would actually say that the worst way of engaging with a play, like the worst way of engaging with a poem, is to actually sit down and read it, because they're meant to be performed. And then it's almost like, the film script. Like, is a film script really, do you actually get a true sense of it by sitting down and reading a full film script, or do you actually get a better sense of it when you're actually seeing it played out on the screen? And that's just sort of something I put to you when we're talking about adaptation and plays. How do we actually deal with that source, that original source? Do we actually just sit down and read it, or do we do something else with it? And I think that is kind of interesting. Also, one other question I have is, how does one add something new to Romeo and Juliet when the dialogue cannot change? And Baz really didn't want to add new dialogue or anything like that. What does he actually have to do to make it seem fresh and make it seem original? Clearly, in this case, he brings his Bazness to it. All right, so this is an interesting table that we're looking at. So the opening, I mean, we know this is faithful, right? Because the opening scenes of the film include the prologue and Act 1, Scene 1 of the play, right? So if you're very familiar with the play and you start to watch the movie, you're going to know that this is a very, very faithful work because it's following that structure and that style from the play. Fans are not mistaken for the subject. But equally, it plays differently, right? There's something else going on, and it introduces sort of a mixture of genres. It's very Baroque in what it's doing. Now, what this table is doing is it's saying on one side all the things that you see and all the meanings that you actually take and all the things that are being introduced just in this opening sequence, right? So you've got, the individual versus the bad guys, so we're sort of introducing a kind of thriller. We've got a police procedural drama going on. We've got a Western, so it's a nature of authority. It feels like a Western. There's martial arts representation going on. There's social anarchy with the fire. There's cars. We're not used to cars in a Shakespeare story at all. Weapons, guns, modern weapons, boots, like again, Western reference. So there's all these things going on. Also, Latin culture is very, very prevalent in this opening sequence. So yes, it's sort of playing like Romeo and Juliet, but unlike Romeo and Juliet that we've ever seen. And that is actually quite compelling and interesting. And other people have since tried to do similar things with Shakespeare, and I would say they haven't succeeded to the extent that Baz Luhrmann has. All right, now something else that sort of takes it away from the typical Shakespeare is the casting. And what we've got in these roles are Claire Danes and Leonardo DiCaprio. And despite Leonardo DiCaprio now being an Academy Award winner and all of that, both of these stars are Hollywood stars. That's what they are. They're cute. Well, they were very cute when they made this film. Young, hip, and you want to cast them in your film if you could, because they both look good. They both have a young fan base. They're not the sort of stars that you associate with serious Shakespeare, right? And I think that's what's really interesting about the film. That if you actually cast people who don't actually belong in Shakespeare, then suddenly it becomes sort of an essay on Shakespeare and on Romeo and Juliet, which is really interesting. And there's something to think about with the casting, and we can talk about that. As Leach argues, Romeo and Juliet plays around with adaptation through its own play of adaptation, right? So it's kind of questioning its adaptation and what you can actually do with adaptation. So it doesn't faithfully apply to one particular mode, Thomas Leach's modes, and we'll talk through each one now. And so the question I have to you is, so it's doing all these different things with all these different modes of adaptation, where a lot of adaptations just sort of follow one particular mode, as we'll see across the course. Now, is this distracting? Does it work? Do you like the kind of, that it's always sort of jumping around and doing different things? Does it give you a deeper understanding of Romeo and Juliet? All right, and now Australian films are actually known, and if you want to call this an Australian film, you can. A lot of people wouldn't, some people would. Baz Luhrmann is Australian. Some of it was shot in Sydney. But they sort of jump around a lot through genres and things like that. The Dressmaker being another obvious recent example. Now, with The Great Gatsby, I'm assuming a lot of you have seen The Great Gatsby, Baz Luhrmann's Great Gatsby. Was he attempting to do something similar, where there's a similar style going on, there's a similar jumping around of genre. He's using the same style. Leonardo DiCaprio is back. So it's kind of interesting to think that maybe Romeo plus Juliet and The Great Gatsby actually belong together, and certainly when we're talking about adaptation of Baz Luhrmann, I think they really do belong together. But that's something else to think about also when we're watching or rewatching Romeo and Juliet. Does it actually remind you a lot of The Great Gatsby and what Baz is doing in The Great Gatsby? And what's really interesting about The Great Gatsby is that it actually, in my opinion, it doesn't work. It fails. It's a failed adaptation for a number of reasons. It's a fascinating adaptation, but it's a failure. Romeo plus Juliet, I don't think is a failure. I think it's a great technical achievement. So let's just talk through each adaptation mode. So number one, its extreme reluctance to change Shakespeare's exact words, despite heavy cuts throughout, indicates it as a celebration of Shakespeare's tragedy. Right, so celebration being an important mode of Thomas Leach. And celebration is when you don't want to do anything that's kind of going to screw up the original source, right? And you know he has great faith and great commitment to the original source, the original play, because he doesn't want to change any of the dialogue, right? And I think that's really interesting. He doesn't introduce any new dialogue. It makes many adjustments to its source, so he does make adjustments to the source. He compresses many lines and speeches, so he doesn't add, but he does subtract, right? Doesn't add, but he does subtract. So you do see differences to the, what actually appeared in the original Shakespeare play. In addition to this, it expands Shakespeare's death scene and seeks to correct it by having Juliet awaken just in time to see Romeo poison himself, giving the doomed lovers time for one last living embrace. And that's very important. That's very different to actually what's going on in the play. Also, just think about the pace of this as adjustment. It's adjusting the pace. It's fast, it's frenetic, it's schematic, and that's really interesting when you're talking about Romeo and Juliet and what Baz is actually bringing to that. So Luhrmann's creation of the visual track and a soundtrack, pointedly at odds with Shakespeare's poetry, separates the dialogue from the rest of the film, which assumes a status of neoclassical imitation. This is kind of playing around with different sorts of genres and thinking about it. So the film kind of plays a bit like a gangster, a bit like a western, a bit like a love tragedy, a bit like a domestic family drama. He's kind of always playing around with all different things, right? And what he's really interested in is not essentially adapting Shakespeare's play, but adapting Shakespeare's language. And that's what he's really interested in here. It's an adaptation of the language. And last week I was talking to you about what is actually, when someone's adapting, what exactly are they adapting? Are they adapting plot? Are they adapting story? Are they adapting style? Are they adapting tone? In this case, he is adapting language, and that's really important to understand going into this adaptation. Now, despite its modern day production, Luhrmann seeks to translate the spirit of Shakespeare's play for a modern audience through revision, right? So the candles become neon lights. When you're watching it, think of all the different ways that he's revising what's actually going on in the original Shakespeare, and what he's actually doing visually to give you a different way of understanding and engaging with Shakespeare. So Luhrmann is notorious for his colonisation of his sources. So the colonisation is really when the auteur, that's the director, they put their own distinct contemporary stamp on the film, right? So think how the film relates to Baz's other movies. If you've seen his other movies, like, Moulin Rouge and The Great Gatsby and Australia, and think about how it's all there and it's all being played out in Romeo plus Juliet. Right? Think of his pace, think of his style, think of his marketing. The film was marketed in a similar way to a lot of Baz's other films. The casting, there's similar actors who appear across all of his films, which again is really interesting. And also a heavy use of Australian actors, which Baz has always done. It constantly questions itself through its destructions. So think of adaptation also as a deconstruction, I apologise. It's a deconstruction. And with adaptation, it's deconstructing the whole idea of adaptation. So what it's actually doing is it's saying, how do I adapt this? What do I actually do? How does one adapt this work? Richard III, which is a documentary I was speaking about recently, is interesting because that's actually a documentary about how Al Pacino, Winona Ryder and others sit down and they're just talking about, okay, how do we actually adapt Richard III? Now, Romeo and Juliet is a different sort of deconstruction, right? But it does make direct references to itself as deconstruction of Shakespeare. It casts unlikely Shakespearean actors. So what it's actually asking is, if I was going to cast these stars, right, these Hollywood young, beautiful, un-Shakespeare actors and stars, how will they actually play these roles? How will they go about them? So you're essentially asking yourself these questions as you're watching through the film with them. How would one shoot this play as a genre mashup? And that's kind of what Baz is interested in. It is a mashup of many different sorts of genres. So there's all these questions being asked through the style and the tone and creative choices that he's made. The film is filled with examples of both parody and pastiche, right? And we'll talk about pastiche in a couple of weeks, but just think of the comic moments and how they're actually playing around with slapstick comedy. You know, like when Romeo accosts Juliet at a balcony, he trips over the swimming pool gear. You know, he falls into the pool once he takes Juliet with him because he's holding on to her. Right, so it's always playing around with the whole idea of parody. And you don't really know where you're at because you can go from extreme drama to a hysterical moment of laughter and really within the same couple of seconds of screen time, which is really interesting. Lumen is fond of secondary imitation. Okay, this is kind of the remake, if you want to think about secondary imitations like that. And like the pool itself, right, that's actually faithfully copied from the 1936 MGM Romeo and Juliet film, right? So it's kind of, it understands its place within the Romeo and Juliet canon, and it is respectful to that. It's not trying to go so far away from it that this is unrecognizable as a Romeo and Juliet film like other Romeo and Juliet films. And just finally, Lumen's film depend more than most on a dense network of illusion. Right now, illusion is really when it's kind of alluding to other things, kind of outside the film. So more to the cultural context that we're talking about. So, you know, think of this film and think of his use of the music, the cutting of the music. When was this music recorded? The contemporary nature of the music that Baz Luhrmann has always used. His billboard references, the product placement. Baz is not against product placement, and you've got product placement all throughout this film, which again is really interesting. Okay, so I'll leave it there. That's me kind of working through, well, not me, but Romeo plus Juliet, working through Leach's 10 modes of adaptation. If you want to read more, it's in the chapter, which is the reading for this week. You can sort of read through it at your own pace. But this is kind of sets up all the different modes and how this one particular film is kind of playing around with all these different sorts of modes. And it's a good way to think about Thomas Leach's modes is it's not, you know, it's not like there's one film for each mode. You know, some films have a real play around with all different sorts of modes, whereas other films might only be a strictly thinking about itself through one of these particular modes. And like I asked at the start, is his use of all these different sorts of modes and playing around with all these different sorts of modes, is that distracting or is that something that you really like? And is it sort of keeping Shakespeare sort of fresh and unpredictable in a way that perhaps Shakespeare has become a little too unfresh and a little too predictable? Okay, I'll leave it there and I'll see you at the screening.